I think there's been a lot of apt community criticism. And I think the biggest thing that we've learned is no matter how much time you spend debating strategic hypotheses, nothing beats putting code into production in front of users. It instantly validates or invalidates a whole slew of hypotheses. And so just pick the thing that's quickest to ship it, and then see what happens.
Hello and welcome to Web3 with A16Z, a show about building the next era of the internet by the team at A16Z Crypto. That includes me, host Robert Hackett. Today's episode features Jing Wang, CEO and Executive Director of the Optimism Foundation, along with A16Z Crypto CTO Eddy Lazzarin. We discuss the peculiarities of open source software, including the incentives that bind contributors together, trade-offs between the freedom to customize versus sticking to standards, and the challenges in setting up and running a foundation. We also cover the nuances of governance and accountability, the importance of vibes, the indispensability of shipping products versus debating roadmaps, and the vision behind the so-called Superchain. As head of the Optimism Foundation, Wang helps steward the Optimism Collective, a band of decentralized companies, communities, contributors, and others who are using a suite of open source software called the OP Stack to scale the Ethereum blockchain network. The OP Stack also powers a number of popular Layer 2 rollups, including Base, which we covered in last week's episode with its creator and lead, Coinbase's head of protocols, Jesse Pollak. Be sure also to check out the A16Z YouTube channel for video podcast episodes, as well as talks from our recent Startup Accelerator program, CSX, featuring Jing, co-founder Carl Flourish, and more. As a reminder, none of the following should be taken as tax, business, legal, or investment advice. See a16zcrypto.com/disclosures for more important information, including a link to a list of our investments. Jing, tell me about the early days of Ethereum. I'm sure you've got some stories from back in the day. You've been a part of this community since it basically was a community.
I first joined as a Bitcoiner, and I didn't come into Ethereum until 2017, when basically the first early, more mainstream wave of people entered also. I would say that I was attracted by the culture. You really felt like you were one of many building towards something together, which is something that we've really tried to replicate or follow with optimism culture. And it wasn't about what you individually or independently could accomplish. So those were early Ethereum vibes. I think Ethereum and L1 governance has done a really great job of keeping those vibes. And something that I've been talking about a lot with my team internally is, what aspects of that culture are actually scalable and what aspects of it are difficult to scale. Because when you have widespread cooperative culture, you really only need one bad apple to start trying to take credit for themselves or self-promote to make it no longer rational strategy for participation to be cooperative for everybody else who's contributing together.
I think it's interesting that Jing, you came at this as a Bitcoiner. I met Vitalik back in 2016, and I remember him just talking about the Bitcoin maxis and how, he was so opposed to the Bitcoin maxi worldview. So how does one attract someone from a different tribe over to their tribe? What has to be done? What about the culture do you have to find compelling to actually get someone to make that switch?
That's a tough one, Robert. What a difficult question.
It is a tough one, yeah.
About the Ethereum culture?
Well, I guess I'd be interested to know what you found compelling about Ethereum culture, and then also whether those lessons are generalizable to other projects.
Flexibility and innovation. I think it's a design of Bitcoin that changes are difficult to make. And as much as possible, you want ossification. Ossification is easy to plan around. It makes Bitcoin super reliable for a lot of different use cases. And for me personally, that's just, I wanted to spend my time feeling like I had an impact in how a piece of technology was developing. And I think Ethereum is a lot more flexible, a lot more extensible. There were grants being put forth to cultivating this kind of activity. It was something that was encouraged and rewarded. People gave talks at conferences, and I felt like the time that I spent working on Ethereum was more likely to equate to something that was broadly impactful for a lot of people in the community. Whereas I just didn't see that path for myself with my skill set in the Bitcoin community. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think different cultures exist for a reason. And, never in a million years would I want Bitcoin to be like Ethereum, but never in a million years would I want Ethereum to go the other direction either.
Let's talk more about this, because if Optimism is to succeed and attract all these great contributors and become, like this expansive open source project, you've got to attract those people who are going to do the work and, build on this thing. How does one go about building on something that ultimately you kind of want to recede into the background, right? Like a lot of this blockchain tech, the chain stuff, we sort of want to abstract it away so that people don't even realize that they're using it. They're just sort of getting these benefits without thinking deeply about like the exact nature of the technology behind it. So that presents like a little bit of a marketing challenge, right? Like getting people to be excited about a technology and yet at the same time kind of wanting that technology to recede into the background.
Mm-hmm. So the people who want to contribute are not the same people as those who want the technology to recede into the background. It's like nerds, protocol nerds versus application developers. For application developers, they just want to focus on bringing their product to market, accessing users and distribution and liquidity, and they don't want to suffer the UX of your infrastructure. Look at the onboarding flow. However many steps it is, that's what users will have to inherit. And so for those people, they definitely want it to recede into the background. But there are a lot of folks like Sunnyside Labs, Wonderland, Base, that want to contribute to the infrastructure either because they need it to improve for their core product requirements, or because they got into crypto super early as protocol nerds and they want to contribute their efforts to a credibly open sourced standard.
Yeah, you got me thinking all these things, Robert and Jing, while you're saying, because we have basically from the beginning of crypto, with a few exceptions, there are definitely a few exceptions, so much of it is dev stuff and like builder stuff, and the target demo is kind of technical people. That's just been crypto for so long. I hope it changes eventually, mostly because I think if we had an entire planet of people like preoccupied with the nuances of like cryptography or like decentralized consensus, it would be a profound waste of talent, right? Like we don't need all of humanity thinking about this. But it's true. I think a lot of the people who build on it, they like its properties and they want to litigate its properties and they want to extend it and they want to talk about it with other devs and like, duke it out based on its merits. Like they really like that. So eventually I hope it does withdraw or fade into the background in some sense. But, I mean, maybe it's kind of like maybe one way, another analogy is like cars, like for most people, cars are just like a way to get around whatever. You just get around, like I get into the thing, I pay for it, whatever. But then there's still a community of car nuts. And there will always be a community of car nuts.
My father is one of them.
Yeah. And like they love the details and they're just always going on about it. And it's really neat. And those are the people you want to cater to with certain products. Obviously, those products are not applicable for everybody. And so the point is to say is that at the stage we are in crypto, we're still at like the car nut phase because it's early and everybody has to be an expert and do all those things. So I don't see that going away for the foreseeable future. Like just for, it's going to be years more of that probably. At the same time that there are great mainstream applications. It's too important.
Well, it's like the same flavor of nut as like Satoshi, Vitalik, it's like those nuts that attracted all the early nuts. And then the early nuts had a social hierarchy of nuttiness. And it was like protocol engineering, cryptography, mechanism design that like brought you to the peak of that ladder. And I think that's true today also. People think that, like protocol engineering is like cool and sexy and want to make changes or modifications at the protocol layer that they don't necessarily need to be making because it feels cool to do so.
Totally agree.
Let's back way up. Maybe I could ask quite broadly, why should anybody do stuff on chain? Like, what's the benefit? Why should people be transacting and whatever on chain?
I think something that is underappreciated about building in Web3 outside of the like decentralization meme is just straight up the open source culture. And this is achievable with or without decentralization. But I think what we have in Web3 is a lot of standards that people have organized around. And having these standards makes building tools easier. It makes building applications easier. Anything from the ERC20 standard to bridge standards, the EVM as a standard, Solidity, it just brings, when we talk about like composability and interoperability, it's not just about co-locating on the same state space. A lot of it is about using the same tools and the same standards.
Yeah, I think that's so apt. I've been having a lot of conversations with people who were doing NFT stuff a couple of years ago, and it's really interesting to see the way they're sort of like contorting themselves. Like they're still using NFTs because the standards are so valuable, and there's nothing sort of like it. But in order to message it to other people, they're like, "Oh no, they're digital assets, or they're digital collectibles, or they're this and that," sort of like obscuring the back end. But when you ask if there's anything else they could be using, it's sort of like, well, not really. It's this is really the only thing that we can use that to accomplish what we need.
Yeah, I think, like one common answer is like decentralization, it's power to the people. Like what power, where, to who? Like, are we really accomplishing that? Maybe in some pockets, and maybe that's a goal, but I don't think it's achieved. And I don't think it's the current primary value prop.
Yeah, we have this conversation a lot here about like, what does decentralization mean? It's such like a big unwieldy word. It kind of obscures what's going on. And I've always really liked the way Chris Dixon describes it as, community owned and operated networks. I feel like that kind of makes the point stick.
Yeah, it's interesting because it does mean a lot of things, and it means something different in every context that you use it. There's like authoritative decentralization, who has the ability to upgrade the system, who has the ability to push forward a proposal. There's operational decentralization, like who has the right to execute the work, who has the right to administer a certain process. And then there's also technical decentralization. It's like, the number of nodes in a network, the resilience of it, the distribution, either geographic or otherwise. And in each of these aspects, the word decentralization is actually pointing to a slightly different value prop. Maybe it's like capture resistance. Maybe it's redundancy.
The power is located somewhere else in the network than the obvious center, right? That's like really what it means. And it could be located in a lot of places. There could be no power located in the center because it's immutable. There could be no power located in the center because it's been explicitly distributed to a certain set of stakeholders. It could you see what I'm saying? Like just something's not being in the center does not really explain what it is. That's why it's so easy to argue so long about what we even mean when we talk about decentralization. But the reason people harp on it is because there's so many interesting things that you can achieve if you find a technical or social technical means of taking the power out of the center. It's just a really cool design space that's even linguistically underexplored, right? It's just, we don't have a lot of great words for it. Yeah, my shot at the answer, Robert, like the quick, like why should anybody do something on chain, do things on chain? I love Jing's answer. Like, open source libraries can't monetize. They've never been able to monetize. They've never been able to capture resilient network effects beyond like the use of the code. Putting that on chain.
The traditional way to monetize open source is sort of like you've got the open source code and then you kind of like build the service on it that's optimized and give all these sort of like nice add-ons to businesses.
Yeah, and then if it's in the wrong place, then they just end up re-centralizing it. Blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you put it on chain and you allow the network effects to accumulate there, then the open source can live forever, maybe. But another cut that I really like is a lot of complicated things require an intermediary. You need that. And the question is, whether you rely on a trusted intermediary or a trustless one. And if you do stuff on chain, you're using a trust minimized intermediary. And that's really, really cool because you can take all these things for granted. Stuff we talk about all the time. Like that's the basic idea. You can choose this, you can choose that. They all remain interoperable. Other people can build on those things. And as long as you trust that programming environment, you can trust that things behave as you'll expect them to behave.
Yeah, this sort of ambiguity around decentralization and what it means and different ways you can kind of slice and dice it. It makes me wonder, Jing, what aspect of decentralization is most important to optimism?
I think there are a lot of different layers of our stack that require decentralization and all for different things. So for the governance of the protocol and its upgrades, capture resistance is the most important thing. And then for the technical protocol, it's not just capture resistance, but it's also security and resilience of the network. And so all of these value props are achieved by decentralizing in different ways. Maybe it's your token in the hands of a lot of people. Maybe it's setting up a bicameral voting system. Maybe it's by having a multi-prover system. And in terms of the operation of optimism, we also think about decentralization as something to aim for, but it's not for the security of the system and it's not for the capture resistance of the protocol. It's just something that doubles down on our open sourciness. Like, we're fully MIT licensed. And one way to look at that is, wow, that sucks because everyone can look at your code and fork it and you have no moat. And another way to look at that is, well, it's also way easier to build a standard and attract an ecosystem of contributors outside of what your recruiting team is capable of finding. And that's an advantage that we have. We've been able to execute vast swaths of the code base through a community and through external contributors. So when you think about actually, like, community ownership, who is your community? Who's owning what? And I think these are the different aspects of decentralization that we care about internally.
Yeah, you mentioned a few pieces there, from governance, sort of making the governance of the system resilient, to capture, to making the technology able to resist attack, and then also just sort of like the ethos underlying the organization as well. I'd love to bite off each of those in turn, but maybe we can start with that last one. I wonder, being sort of the head of a foundation that is, working on these sort of open source decentralized projects, how do you sort of like live and breathe that ethos of decentralization in your day-to-day work?
Something I say to my team often is that we're not even aware of the centralization biases that we have. And because we have those biases, it's actually difficult to propagate consistent decision making. So let's say you want to be fully MIT licensed and open source. Well, how many companies out there are actually operating this way? How many of us have experience operating that way? The natural tendency is to go and hire a bunch of people to your organization because we, live and breathe by the meme that it's easier to execute with centralized planning. But is that true? I don't actually think it is. You guys remember how before the pandemic, all companies required that you go to the office and show up in person because everyone believed that was the best way to work because, remote was just not as high context. But the pandemic forced everyone to write things down very clearly, write down decisions, do meetings really well, be more crisp about the strategy, do planning better. And so I actually think that operating for a remote culture made it a lot easier for companies to scale beyond 20, 100, et cetera, people. And so similarly for, quote unquote, decentralized workforce, I think it's similar to going remote. Conceptually, we're all accustomed to hiring people into our own teams with really clear accountability and an HR team and these structures that we're familiar with. But what if you were forced to write your spec or the problem that you're trying to solve so fucking clearly that an external team doesn't have to talk to you and they know exactly what needs to be done to solve that problem? How much more could you scale execution if your team was capable of planning, writing, and operating in that way?
I want to build on that a little bit because there's this thing people may or may not have heard of called the theory of the firm. Right? This is
Ronald Coase, the economist?
Yeah, this is Coase's essay about the theory of the firm. And this is the simplest possible cut for the theory of the firm, is that there are different institutions because internal transaction costs, and when I say transaction costs, I don't mean in the blockchain setting. I mean transaction costs like we talk, we make a deal, we agree on a thing, we coordinate, we agree on a spec, we negotiate, we pay each other even, right? All these things are very complicated transactions. The internal transaction costs of a firm are lower than between firms. Right. And that's because you can take certain things for granted, like shared infrastructure, alignment towards certain goals, shared managerial structure. There's all these things you can take for granted. And one way I'm interpreting what you're saying, Jing, is that a lot of our defaults, how we think about work, are tuned to taking advantage of the low internal transaction costs. But if you have a wide decentralized ecosystem where you can have a bunch of partners who have slightly different goals but are aligned in some key ways, you may actually have a much wider set, a very, very wide set of external contributors. And even if the external transaction costs are a little bit higher, which they are, because like there's all these different people, they're far away, the scale of that is so big and so powerful because of putting things on chain, sharing the code, building on top of each other's stuff, composability, all those things. The benefits of very, very high quality coordination with your external contributors is high enough that it's worth enduring those high external transaction costs and actually optimizing to those in the culture of the company.
Exactly. Like, what is external? What outside of payroll? Why is that fundamentally a lower transaction cost? Why can't you just do the onboarding or the culture setting or whatever, process set up for contributions to reduce those transaction costs?
Yeah. And HR stuff is hard and important or whatever, but the opportunity we have with everybody coordinating on the ways to make uniformly valuable block space as like a Optimism example, the benefits are so high, we're kind of leaving a lot on the table if we're preoccupied with the internal transaction costs. Yeah, anyway,
exactly.
Yeah.
I remember us having this like HR conversation around going remote also. Like, how am I going to know if someone's having a good time if I can't see their face when they show up to work? Well, I guess you just got to ask them, So yeah, just change. I find myself getting stuck in the traditional mental models all the time. And you make a decision that is at a very particular part of the trade-off spectrum, fully open sourcing all of your code. And if the other sub-decisions that you make don't take advantage of the benefits of sitting on that part of the trade-off spectrum and make them over here, then you're straddling the worst of both worlds. And, every 6 months or so, I'll have this big epiphany about why something has been hard. And it'll be because I'm latched on to one of these, default modes of thinking. And so this one about internal versus external contribution is my epiphany from 6 months ago.
That's a really valuable one.
Okay, I have a question. What is the most nut jobby thing you heard that turned out to be true?
In all my days? Or specifically from a crypto perspective?
I mean, I guess both. Whatever comes to mind.
Oh, God.
It's a good one.
I'm filtering through all of the true answers to that question that we can't share. Some conspiracies are too spicy for the public.
My favorite is whenever we get into random conversations and Eddy's there, he'll drop into a whisper, which for Eddy isn't really a whisper. It's just like a loud, deep, lower register. And then he goes into a conference room and he shuts the door and he just unloads. And Carl and I will just be like, holy shit. Yeah. Wow.
Amazing.
He's like, think about the Superchain, manifest destiny. Why did all these settlers come over? Because they had land rights. There was a new government being formed. They had property rights. And in exchange for that, they're willing to pay taxes. And that's...
Good times.
Good times.
Good times. Yeah, good times. Yeah, I don't know, Robert.
All this talk feels like a really good segue to talk about the Superchain. Jing, what is the Superchain? What is the vision for it? And how does Optimism plan to get us there?
The Superchain is our vision of horizontally scalable world computing. And I think there's a couple Web2 analogs. One is, Docker or AWS as an analog, but neither of these examples really perfectly fit into what we're attempting to build. I think a lot of folks in the blockchain industry started out with a single blockchain, and lots of early discourse around who will win was what chain will win. And, you start having a single slightly viral application and you quickly realize it's not one chain versus another. Chains are containers for compute, and you have to horizontally scale if you want to support what internet scale applications genuinely need. And so that's what the Superchain is.
Say more about that. How do you go from this competition to cooperation? I think there are still people who, still these tribal battles over which chain is the supreme one.
Oh, for sure. But at least everyone in the Superchain is in a more collaborative mode than outside of the Superchain because first of all, let's start with the fact that it is MIT licensed code. So you could take it, you can fork it, and you can modify it, and you don't have to pay us a dime. You don't have to open source any of your changes. It's like Blast forked it, hit a single change in a bunch of typo fixes, which was basically just changing the license, and have tons of TVL secured on their chain. And you could go do that. That is not the Superchain. That is a fork of the OP stack. So everyone who's part of the Superchain today is agreeing to pay a revenue split for MIT licensed code that is fundamentally free. You could literally go and spin up your own instance and do whatever you wanted and not pay us a dime. So why would it be the financially optimal strategy to pay? Well, you get access to the liquidity and the users and the development of everybody else in the Superchain. You are opting into a fundamentally cooperative multiplayer game because it's a better game to play, better in a lot of ways. It could be better because it lowers your operational overhead. It could be better because it increases your access to a broad distribution of users. Whatever it is, it's different for every single person who decides to opt in, but it is opt-in.
So basically, there are two paths you can take. You can fork the code and do your own thing. You mentioned Blast has done this and not be part of the Superchain, or you can take the code and join the team, join the supergroup, and pay your dues, as it were. Tell me more about these two paths and why someone would want to indeed, take the latter route.
The level of maturity of the technology within the blockchain industry at large is a lot less mature than what people would expect from Web 2 when they look at the kinds of valuations that exist within the blockchain industry. So all this infrastructure is incredibly novel, new, untested, feature incomplete, Optimism included, Optimism especially. And so for a lot of projects that are trying to make a decision about what scaling infrastructure to use, they're not just asking themselves, what is the best tech today? They're also asking themselves, what is likely to be the winning tech down the line? And what does winning tech actually mean? Winning tech could mean the technology or the block space that gets the most network effects. So, you have the best distribution to liquidity and users. It could mean the technology that is most likely to become the standard. So whatever tooling that you rely on today is also going to evolve as your project evolves. And I think there are a few explicit design choices that we've made that we believe make it more likely that we will be the winning tech, both in terms of network effects as well as in terms of standardization. And being fully open sourced is one of them. So for projects that want to be part of defining the standard, like Base on 4844, for example, the Optimism community and the OP stack give you a really clear path towards contributing to the standards that the entire superchain operates on. And so not only do you have a cleaner path to making the modifications that you want to make, that also makes it more likely that the infrastructure and the code base improves for everybody else that relies on it, which also makes it more likely that this is the stack that gets standardized, aka winning tech by a lot of folks' definitions. And so you can go over there in your silo and you can make the modifications to the OP stack that suit you and you don't have to pay anything. But it also means it's that much harder for wallets, block explorers, oracles, bridges to go and integrate with you. Or you can pick to launch a standard config chain, or if the standard config doesn't suit your needs, contribute to the core engineering work required for it to suit your needs and use a stack that will be supported by all the aforementioned services.
Chris Dixon has a great framework for thinking about this. He says that composability, which is sort of this key property of open source software, composability is to software as compound growth is to finance, or as Moore's law is to chip making. And so, you mentioned that the technology right now, it's still inchoate. It's still coming together. It's still pretty nascent. There are things that need to be done to shore it up and scale it and make sure that it can actually operate as everybody intends and has this grand vision for. But that's not what we're basing the decision off of right now. It's really about this sort of quality that the fact that it is open source, the fact that it is composable, enables these network effects to accrue and this value to, be generated from it, even if you can't defend it as you would a traditional business moat.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have a way to think about the Superchain, and this is kind of a loaded analogy with a lot of conceptual baggage, but I think of it like the United States, right? Or like the Articles of Confederation, right? Where there are separate states. They are technically sovereign, right? So the Articles of Confederation, like pre-contemporary constitution, right? They're sovereign, but they have committed to shared legalistic properties. Right. Without going into details, like they are part of a single defense pact. They have rules about their commerce, right? And they are, in other words, more interoperable with each other than they are with other countries, right? And if someone comes in and is a citizen of one, like a user of one, their application is useful in one, then it gets automatic privileges with those other states, right? That make it more interoperable, more usable, easier, more liquid, whatever the kind of crypto and analogs are. And so of course, if you fork OP Stack and you just go do your own thing, that's like being a country that just copied the U.S. Constitution, and that's fine. There's a lot of them actually. Like a lot of modern constitutions are just tweaks to the Bill of Rights and tweaks to the American Constitution, but it's obviously a separate thing completely. And that can be a great benefit. It can also be a great liability. And that country would probably prefer to be an American state. So I'm not trying to make a political point here, but just just saying, like, there's strong advantages to attaching yourself to like a big interoperable system. I think there's a lot of states that are huge, successful states that part of that success is because they're part of this bigger thing, right? And each of the states together are bigger collectively together than they could have been if they were all separate little countries, right? If they were self-balkanized, so to speak.
Nice.
Eddy, your example, though, of the Articles of Confederation, that didn't pan out so well in practice.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. And that's because I think they needed a very potent central authority. Obviously, there's all kinds of constitution scholars that are just going to slap me around, I'm sure. And I'm like totally wrong. But I think, well, I'm not going to get into like 18th century history, but I think despite flaws, let me kind of go back, Robert, and re-answer this.
I'm expecting you to take us into a conference room and use your low voice.
Pop off, Eddy.
I know. The thing is, I can't do that right now. I'm avoiding trying to do that right now. Yeah, in short, okay, well, I'd say, like, yeah, the Articles of Confederation didn't work. You're right. And without being a constitutional scholar about it, the reasons that it didn't work are complicated. They have to do with land, they have to do with defense, they have to do with foreign policy, they have to do with commerce rules, all of these things. These are crazy complicated things. The same things that the Superchain will have to solve, the same thing that blockchains in general will have to solve, right? We always talk about composability as this great thing, and it is. It's incredibly powerful. It also means that specific attacks are possible between blockchains and between applications on blockchains. It's powerful in every direction, right? It makes it easier to coordinate. It makes it easier to undermine. So we'll have to evolve this, right? And the truth is that when we don't have a very, very clear technical path about how we're going to resolve things, and obviously everybody's working on making a clear technical path. In the absence of a technical path, you need a culture that has shared values. And those values will eventually emerge in technical solutions, binding principles, all the types of things that I'm very confident will also be a part of how blockchains think about themselves and govern themselves in the future.
Let's dig into some of that. You mentioned like the security concerns about how different blockchains could attack one another. Presumably members of the Superchain could do this. I don't know. There's some like vying.
Yeah, I mean, without going way down a theoretical path, it's just, if you allow other people to read and write state from your blockchain, like there's things that can happen, right? And it's just something that they'll have to design around.
Yeah, so I guess along this analogy, national security is fault provability of your chain. And right now, that's hard to do because lots of folks want customizations. Either the core chain product is not cheap enough, or the transactions are not low enough latency. Internally, we're still grappling with a lot of these product questions. Like, what is the right layer of the stack to actually solve these at? Should it be solved with tooling? Is it actually a protocol change? What about the consensus critical changes? What about like node changes, anything bringing us away from EVM equivalence? How should we deal with that? Because at the end of the day, if we want to automate the process of deploying a net new chain that is fault provable with interoperable secure message passing with other chains, where you can have things like a fungible token across all interoperable chains, then you need these chains to be running the same fault provable config. And that's not the case for all chains in the superchain today. And so we have this concept of like frontier chains in the superchain. And you can think of it like jailbroken phones, people who have taken the standard config and modified it to suit their needs. And then we have standard config chains like Coinbase, like OP mainnet, that run a config that is fault provable. And so over time, we hope to see that the core chain product gets ossified enough such that any net new chain is deployed is automatically fault provable. And then any innovations that people want to see in terms of net new features can be done at a different layer of abstraction that doesn't impact quote unquote national security.
When you say a different layer of abstraction, do you mean like, are we talking like L3s, L4s, or like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, that could be. It could be L3s. It could be just outside of the core protocol. It could be with certain tools that get built. It could be with UX tricks. Like when people say they need a transaction under 200 milliseconds, do they need it to securely execute and finalize within 200 milliseconds? Or do they just need a pop-up that is reliable 90% of the time to tell their user that the transaction is finalized? Every single app has such different needs and constraints. And so we want to balance safety and security without blocking innovation and net new features. So that just means like segmenting the layers of the stack for explicit purposes and then pushing everything else up.
How far off do you think we are from that day when we have the fully fledged superchain that you're describing?
I don't know anyone else who sucks more than me at time estimations. So
that's super tough. I couldn't guess either.
It's a priority because it just makes decisions difficult. And so figuring out, when we talk about a modular stack, which components of it need to be modular how? And then what are the interfaces for interacting with that modularity? And then how does that impact security, safety, but also flexibility and extensibility? This is an active, ongoing conversation that I had like a 4-hour argument yesterday with my co-founders. Good argument.
What was tell us about that. What was the outcome?
I can't.
Come on.
Give us like 7 more hours of arguing and then we'll poop out a roadmap.
Okay, here's a question for you. There is the OP mainnet. And if you want to attract all these other players into the mix to host chains of their own, is there any, it's open source for sure, but how do you persuade potential superchain hosters, runners, partners, whatever you call them?
Actually, we do have a term for chain people. They're chain governors.
I see. So how do you convince them that they're on your team, that they're on your side, and that you're not going to be like basically competing with them and OP mainnet is going to be the thing that sort of like rules everything?
Yeah. In an ideal world, OP mainnet is absolutely negligible. And there's thousands and thousands of chains operating in the superchain. So that's the goal that we're trying to drive towards. And there's a few ways that we treat these chains as our own block space. First of all, we have a token treasury. And when we do things like retroactive public goods funding or grant funding or dev tool sponsorships, we do so for every single chain. And so it's not just things built on OP mainnet that are eligible for retroactive public goods funding. It's available across the entire superchain. The treasury is for the superchain, not for OP mainnet. OP mainnet is us dogfooding our protocol.
Okay, so it's sort of like a testing ground.
Mm-hmm. And it's also the home of OP governance.
So you referenced retroactive public goods funding, and we haven't walked through what that is and the mechanism for it. And this is sort of a weird and interesting way to attract people to build and to get things done. Tell me more about that, how that works, and why Optimism's gone with that approach.
You know, when you're a nonprofit, you have like two modes of acquiring funding, which is donations and grants. And if you're a startup with a business model or a business model at some point, then you can also get investment and venture capital. And a lot of really smart people who want to do good for the world aren't trying to become billionaires. They're just trying to be adequately compensated for the impact that they actually provide. And so you either go to a nonprofit that's, you know, scraping by funding on a regular basis, relying on the goodwill of donors, or you join some maybe like more explicitly capital motivated team that maybe doesn't align with your values. And so what do you do if you're an open source developer? You want to be appropriately rewarded for your impact. You don't want to make trade-offs like extracting from your users or adding paywalls on something that you believe should be fundamentally open source. Where do you go if you're one of those people? If you are like the early Optimism founding team? And so that is the goal of Retro PGF. It's to create a community of contributors and also create the impact funding mechanism where they can be adequately rewarded for the impact that they've created. Impact equals profit. And our hope is that by successfully doing a bunch of rounds of this and working on the impact oracle, that will open these teams up not just to donations and grant funding, but also hopefully an ecosystem of venture capitalists that are making bets on their ability to provide impact and receive Retro PGF.
Well said.
Going back to something that, Eddie, you brought up at the beginning, the theory of the firm. What's really interesting about this to me is that, you know, there are these different ways that humans can organize. And maybe there's one that's like a really profit-seeking corporation of some sort like that. Maybe you've got a nonprofit where you have goals and aspirations that are not strictly monetary, but you suffer from the fact that you don't have a sort of native business model and you struggle to get by. You know, as Jing, you said, you're reliant on grants and donations, but maybe there are these different ways that you can kind of like find a sort of pathway between these two areas where you can still give people incentives. You can still encourage people to work together to solve problems and to be rewarded for their effort. But you're kind of in this middle way. You're not, you know, fully maxed out on profit in the one direction, or, you know, just like poverty stricken and trying to like, you know, get your next meal.
Totally agree with that. Like we don't want to build this massive corporation and incentivize people through their employment contracts. We want the kinds of creativity that you see in early startup teams or small people coming together because they're passionate about something. And so the goal of Retro PGF is to enable those people to find it worth their while to come together to work on something fully open source. And we want the incentives behind how they make design choices for whatever they're building to be about providing impact to the broader Optimism collective, not to be about the way to protect their IP and protect their moat to enable them to charge some fee down the line. Like literally, where do you go if you want to do something like that today?
It's a great point. Maybe we can shift gears a little bit. I like the whole thread we had about, you know, how do you recruit these new super chains, right? That's an important thing. But I feel like there's so much more to say. Like also talking about like how to think about other blockchains, how to think about when someone should make a new OP chain. Like, right, when someone should make a chain that should join the super chain, like that's an interesting one. Maybe saying something about specific ones, like something we haven't established. Actually, that's a good one. Is that something we haven't established at all in the conversation? Is like there's multiple L2s in the super chain. Why are there multiple L2s in the super chain? One answer is the scalability answer. They're all kind of execution shards, sort of. But then the other is the variation between them. Maybe there are some examples. Like I think Redstone WorldCoin and Base, or WorldNet and Base are like three really cool examples, Jing. I don't know if you want to talk about them at all, because they're all totally different. They're all part of Superchain. They will be. They're completely
I
different.
don't want them to be different.
You want them to be the same?
Yes. I want them to all be fault provable.
Yeah, they should all be fault provable. That's definitely a thing they should all share. But you don't think that there may be like a slightly different programming environment, maybe different precompiles, maybe different availability layers, maybe?
So it's like, kind of something I'm trying to figure out is like aberrations to the standard are incredibly difficult to scale. Like standardization makes the, automatic addition of net new chains orders of magnitude easier to solve as an engineering problem. And so, I'm trying to like build all the things that they want so that they don't have to be different.
Why do we need a super chain at all? Why not just have one chain sort of handle everything? You have these instances of different projects building their own chains. Presumably, they're getting some value in terms of differentiating a little bit and hosting their own thing. But what are those sort of different flavors you can get of L2 chain that make having multiple chains worthwhile?
Okay, so one thing that we hear a lot is people asking for like a really specific alt-DA layer or a really specific protocol change, or broadly L3s or ZK provability. And then, the question for me is like, okay, what are you really asking for? What does an L3 actually mean to you? Because there's no people say
several
on
of those
top.
things you just said are just costs, right? That's just about costs, right?
A lot of it is about cost. A lot of it is about specifically accessing the liquidity of a single chain, but making security trade-offs so that you're not paying roll-up level transaction fees. Okay, I guess that's also cost. And so I think something that maybe some people don't realize is when you deviate from the standard, you make it a lot harder to secure your chain. You make it a higher overhead to build message passing frameworks and to apply standards in a secure way. So we have a lot of experience with this. We thought that being 90% compatible with the EVM was going to be enough for all of the great things about the EVM to also apply to our infrastructure. But the reality is we're missing like 2 opcodes, and that alone made deploying Uniswap on the V1 of OP mainnet a 1-month effort rather than a one-click deploy. And so every single modification you make, every single deviation from the standard is risk, security risk, integration risk, overhead, cost. And so in an ideal world, Base, Redstone, WorldCoin, maybe there's like 1 or 2 or maybe at max 3 different kinds of configs that we run. And for those who want fault provability in an automated way, people who want to be able to dip into a pool of sequencing compute, people who want secure interoperable message passing, you really have to be running the standard config. And I also acknowledge that the standard config we have today is not feature complete. It's missing a lot of things that people want. Just March, we launched span batches alongside 4844. And so what our span batch feature release did was it took the minimum cost of running an empty chain from $130,000 a month to $600 a month. So previously, having your own chain was this like mega luxury product. And that's just the on-chain costs, the infrastructure costs. That's not even the cost to integrate a block explorer or the cost to have a variety of these other services integrate with your chain. So all that to say, we have customizations today. That's what I meant by frontier chains earlier in the conversation. But everyone has an iPhone today, and they don't use a jailbroken version because Apple has upstreamed all of the most desirable features. And so I'd love the OP stack to get to that point where we have upstreamed all of the most desirable features, and there's no need to launch a custom config.
I see.
Yeah. I definitely see the benefits to uniformity. Definitely. I mean, that's not everything you said is completely correct. At the same time, allowing experimentation at the edges is a big innovation unlock, right? Because you may not anticipate, right, some way that someone configures it that is just so much better for their use case that it's just, It wouldn't work any other way, right? And I think of this as like things that are suitable for experimentation in state law versus things that are preferably federal law, right? Not that like the U.S. government setup is perfect or anything, but it's, I think, in the ideal case, the federal laws are the things that we benefit at a national level from having uniform, and they supervene on top of the state laws such that wherever you are, you can reason about, okay, like these are the federal laws that are applying to me, these are the state laws that are applying to me, and I have some wiggle room in terms of the state laws by moving states. But then like there's kind of a uniformity I can always assume is true state to state. And in some cases that's the liability because now like I can't get away from it. Right. But then it can be a benefit because I can take it for granted. Right. I just know like, kind of like corporate law is at the level of state. Like I know I can make my corporation in Delaware, I can make my corporation wherever, and that's valid across the whole country. Right. So do you think, given in these early stages, it makes sense that as we're developing security and thinking through how it'll all even work, more uniformity is much better because it simplifies our reasoning about the interoperability of the system. But do you think it'll be the case at some point if we mature the technology that we'll be able to specifically codify more parameters that can vary, more configurations that can vary, while adhering to like some minimum properties that need to remain uniform in the superchain?
Yeah, for sure. This is exactly the debate around modularity that we're having internally. It's like, what do we actually need to codify today when we're like just forming as a nation and we don't have enough proof points behind the various things that we want to keep uniform? What are like fundamental components of the system that must be kept uniform for things like national security, fault provability to be standardized across the superchain? And then for all the modifications that people typically want to make at that layer, why do they want to make those modifications? Is it about latency? Is it about making security trade-offs? Like, what is it? And can we enable those modifications or that extensibility to exist at a different layer? And then which of those things are important to prioritize this quarter?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yep. Custom gas tokens, for example, is a big one that people have been asking for, that we have just really been slow on the uptake for because of this debate precisely.
Yeah. For each of these chains, not only are you offering them a way to make the block space more uniform and all these other benefits, like we talked about all these benefits, they need business models, right? And right now there is one business model that's like interesting-ish, and that's running the sequencer and collecting fees as the sequencer. But that could change very significantly, right? Like not only could the superchain as a whole change the way sequencing is done, but there could be decentralized sequencers, there could be shared sequencers. This is a very early stage of the evolution of the tech, allowing each chain in the superchain to reason about its business model could be really, really important for them. And they could all end up choosing something completely different. You could imagine some chain in the superchain that doesn't even charge gas fees, right? Like it just does something completely different. Or that applications pay the gas fees on behalf of users strictly, and there's no user gas fees. I'm just making that up. You could just imagine all types of stuff. But the point is that there's a lot of dimensions I think that they ought to be able to experiment.
So that's an interesting point, because when we made the superchain pivot, we thought that it would be primarily about reducing transaction fees and reducing transaction fee variability so that applications could offer a more consistent end user experience for fee payments, and a cheaper one, or even subsidize the transaction fees if they wanted to. And we thought that that was like the primary use of having your own chain. But really, we've seen people who want to build their own developer ecosystems with their chain. And so, we thought that sequencing fees was something that they would want to reduce or minimize as much as possible. And they would want to, charge more fees at the marketplace level, like layer or whatever they're building. And so actually we've seen people who are resellers of, Optimism block space, Superchain block space, and that block space resale is really valuable, as you've seen with the explosion of building on Base. Because when you purchase Base branded block space, you get lots of other things. You get a retweet from Jesse. You get support. You get marketing. You get BD opportunities. You get access to liquidity and all these other builders. So all those things are super valuable for developers, and that's not something that we anticipated. And so it's something we're trying to adapt to with our product roadmap.
Can you guys explain the sequencer, what it is, how it works, what's going on there?
Yeah.
Did you attend university?
Yes.
Okay. So you know how you took classes with TAs, and it was like TAs that graded your homework and your exams?
For sure.
And if your it's only when your TA fucked up as you checked your TA's grading work that you would go to your professor and dispute the grade that the TA had given, right? Mm-hmm. And so for the university, the professor is a really, really expensive computer to utilize. And so you want to utilize the professor's computation as little as possible. And you want to offload the computation to cheaper, more centralized, and maybe sometimes less reliable TAs. And the way that you ensure quality from the outputs or correctness from the outputs of the TAs is that you enable a challenge mechanism for those who are checking the TA's work with the ultimate arbiter of truth, the professor. So that's when you dip into the professor's salary. And so TAs are roll-up sequencers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that a lot, actually.
Are you sure?
I think so. But this ability to be the one who controls the sequencer gives you some ability to generate revenue. That's some power that the sequencer gives you?
The sequencer can set the transaction fees. So there's a base cost of submitting a block to Ethereum. And so it can never be zero. The cost of operating a chain is never zero. So therefore, the revenue split to the collective is also never zero. There's always a base cost. And you can decide as a sequencer to charge some margin on top of that. And that can be incredibly profitable.
Although presumably that cost will trend downward, right? People will choose the cheapest possible chain for their purposes.
Yes.
Well, yeah, it will, but the sequencers could still be very profitable. They may become less profitable, right? Like the thing that's going to trend down is going to be the cost of block space. That is going to trend down. But whether or not the profitability of sequencers decline or not has to do with how easily they're commodified. And how easy they are to commodify is very, very nuanced
Internal debate on the product roadmap as well. I would say, last year, before we implemented span batches and EIP 404 and all these things, transaction costs on average were like 10 cents per ERC20 cent. And now it's less than 1 cent. And so if you're previously paying 10 cents per transaction as a user, and now the core cost is sub-cent, but the sequencer is charging, let's say, a bigger revenue, a 200% revenue. So the transaction cost is 3 cents. That's still 3x cheaper than what you were paying. And so part of our hypothesis around continually reducing the cost of transactions is that you can increase the margin in a way that's negligible to the end user and maybe even preferable. They don't even notice at all. And it's so much cheaper than it was previously. And that generates more activity, volume, traffic. And so net, you're still making more as a platform or as a chain operator, even though your margins are higher.
Right, I see. So the cost of block space is going down, transactions are getting cheaper. And so to the end user, it's still a great proposition because you're paying less, but that also enables the wielder of the sequencer to have some margin. And even that is sort of tucked into the savings the end user is experiencing.
Exactly. After 404 launched and we're like, oh my God, sub-cent fees. We're like, okay, how long is it? We did some calculations on how long it was going to be before congestion pricing kicked back in. And, activity just went crazy on Base. And at some point, I think a single transaction fee on Base was more expensive than on Ethereum. It was like $38, $50, something like that. And so I guess it's kind of a self-own, we need to do more work on the scaling solution roadmap, but also it's a good indicator of just how much demand there is for base block space and what people are willing to pay.
Yeah. Worth pointing out a little mini point that we often talk about gas pricing is that in a very indirect way, the price of gas is not strictly dependent on, or the price of a transaction is not strictly dependent on the throughput. Right? And that's because once you enter into a scenario where people are auctioning the scarce block space, the price will quickly reach the willingness to pay. Like the top price paid will reach whatever people are willing to pay. Like it doesn't matter how much throughput there is. They need to be in this block right now. They want to do the transaction immediately. And the price will be whatever they are willing to pay at that price to get in, if they have to pay to get ahead of others. Right. Now, of course, if you have massive throughput, then you might never end up in the auction scenario, right? Where there's just tons of space. No one needs to bid to get ahead because others don't need to be excluded. Right. But what happened with Base was just a funny thing. If I recall, there was at the 2.5 million gas limit time, Jing, was that when that was? Basically, oh, okay. There was a brief time where after 48-44, the Base team hadn't yet adjusted, for good reasons. They hadn't yet adjusted the total amount of gas per block. Base was still growing, and there were some applications people were going crazy over, and they just basically blew through the new blob space instantly and got straight back into congestion pricing. So the price converged on the willingness to pay. But that's been fixed, by the way.
Right. Base raised the gas limit, right? So now the congestion pricing has gone down.
Yep.
Since we've been talking about 4844, I should ask, how has life changed pre and post that upgrade?
Okay, so I don't say a lot of stuff publicly, which is something I'm trying to correct through engagements like this. And I think there's been a lot of apt community criticism about things like why it's taken so fucking long for us to ship fault proofs, why it's taken so long for certain governance rights to come online, why it's taken so long for us to adapt to things that others seem to be integrating quite quickly, like alt-DA or custom gas tokens and things like that. And so Twitter commentators will be like, it's because the Optimism team doesn't care about decentralization, or because they don't care about their users, or whatever. There's so many reasons. And I think you all and all the other builders and founders listening to this will understand. It's just figuring out how a team is supposed to work and how work is supposed to be done, and making the wrong calls on strategic decisions or roadmap prioritization, or allowing disagreements over implementation details to go on for too long to a staggering extent. And it has taken a long time to debug why these execution problems were happening. Why is optimism always at the forefront of the vision for how the space will evolve? From optimistic rollups to sequencing to the Superchain, we've always been on the money with the narrative, and we've been able to inspire a lot of people with shared visions to come together. Yet, time and time again, execution has fallen short of our marketing, candidly. And I think that it's been a long, tough road, but through the first quarter of this year, we've shipped a lot, from span batches to 4844 to finally fault proofs to testnet to a number of other things and Bedrock as well. And I think the biggest thing that we've learned from 4844 is no matter how much time you spend debating strategic hypotheses, nothing beats putting code into production in front of users. It instantly validates or invalidates a whole slew of hypotheses that you've spent hours or days debating with your co-founders, execs, team leads. And so, one of these hypotheses was, should we continue focus on quote unquote Gucci gas, pay a little bit higher transaction fee, better security properties, or do we believe that lowering the transaction fee will actually create an explosion of activity? And instead of spending all of that time debating it and reorienting the roadmap and figuring out what we should build next, what we should have done was pick the shortest line from point A to point B, which is just pick the thing that's quickest to ship it, and then see what happens. And so that's the meta thing that we learned from 4844.
Totally. I think that's a really valuable anecdote. I'll add this is one of those things that like I feel like parents say, right? Is like it's a truism, it's a stereotypical, but you cannot overemphasize how true it is. Every portfolio company I talk with, every company I talk with in the space, they say the same thing. This is like a 100-year-old idea. Like you have to just ship the thing. You have to put it in front of users. You don't really know. Premature optimization is the root of all evil, right? Don't try to guess. Just put it out there. I constantly see people thinking that they know better than this. They don't. And then they learn the hard way. It's like a law of nature. Yeah, I think that's great.
I liked your term Gucci gas. So what was the idea there that like this is
it's primo gas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot easier to pronounce than Givenchy gas. So
that's true. Yeah. Good call there.
I used to say it's Gucci to mean like, oh, it's good with me. It's fine. And my co-founder, Carl, thought it meant like, it's pricey, it's expensive, it's luxury. And so he came up with the term Gucci gas to be like, it's a luxury offering with luxury pricing. And so the branding, the security, the like mystique around it is what you're selling. But that's not like Gucci gas is not scaling Ethereum.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I agree that just more scaling is the thing versus tiered pricing. Yeah.
If there was like one thing I wanted to get out to the community that's been like confused by the progress, the like inconsistent waves of progress coming out of the Optimism Collective, like that's why it's just been part of our maturation journey of learning how to communicate with other humans to achieve goals together and like setting a goal and making a plan so that the goal is achievable.
Yeah, I love that. And also, I wanted to ask a little bit about foundations because there have been foundations for a while in crypto, but I don't know that there's like a clean mental model for how people think about them yet. They're evolving really, really quickly, right? I've been asked by a lot of founders in our portfolio and outside our portfolio, just how do I think about a foundation? Because I'd love, somebody to be an advocate for the protocol or whatever the thing is directly, right? To be as like close as they can and to represent it as best they can, independent of the company. But there's risks in setting this up, right? Like, how do you pick the right person to run it? How do you make sure that the foundation is accountable to the protocol and to the, to the whole ecosystem? Have you how has your thinking developed? Like you've been there, tons going on. I think Optimism Foundation is probably one of the busiest. There's tons of projects happening at all times. What have you learned?
So I think it's important that the incentives that govern the foundation, the body bootstrapping incentive design for the collective to have no other incentive other than to do a good job for the collective. There's not some like sidebar profit interest on running a sequencer or creating a profitable services company that is influencing the design of those mechanisms that the collective is bootstrapping with.
Yeah. Well, like for example, how do you think about accountability for the foundation? If the foundation's not doing well, like let's say I'm thinking about making a foundation for my protocol. How do I choose who's going to run it? Maybe I don't have a co-founder that I trust, who's aligned with the goals of the protocol. How would I pick someone? And then second, how could the ecosystem hold them accountable?
And by the way, we've seen how it can go wrong. Like my friend Kathleen Brightman of Tezos, they set up a foundation and they were just embroiled for years in a legal battle. So, it can be a challenge.
So that's actually why I vacated my position as CEO of Optimism PBC to go and stand up the foundation. For me, it was like, okay, is it easier to find someone I trust to promote internally to run what is already a well-functioning company with tons of aligned people, or find a net new person to figure out what to do with a 3 billion token treasury? And so we were operating on a tight timeline. I decided it was easier to promote internally at the labs entity and then go over to the foundation myself. At the foundation, my accountability is to a board of directors, but the ultimate accountability is in the hands of the token holders. And so it is in our charter that the token holders that there's a director who, along a vote of token holders, can remove any director of the Optimism board. And so ultimately, power resides in the hands of the community. Now, this charter has no concept of the citizens' house, which is a super important part of our governance design. And so,
please say a little bit about the citizens' house. and just this sort of theory of governance so far, just how it's
Okay.
developed.
I will say, I'm about to say a bunch of wrong shit. Like Eddie said, someone out there is going to want to smack me around about, wrong things. And so if you find yourself cringing at any of this, jobs.optimism.io, you're actually a great candidate.
That's a good point.
Again, I'm not a governance design expert. My co-founders and I, we're just trying to build a world that we ourselves want to live in. And I think that when we think about power in the hands of the community, what is the community? Well, the community is not just the token holders. It's the contributors, it's the users, it's the fans. And so shouldn't those people also get a say in how the protocol develops? And so we tried to segment it out in two houses, the token house and the citizens house. The token house invests capital, expects economic growth. You could buy tokens. It's like really kind of standard token holder models. And those people are important. They care about whether or not Optimism is able to generate economic activity and grow and build a product that gets adopted. At the same time, we don't want the Optimism platform to be purely about extraction and extracting from the end users. We want this to be a platform built for the end users. And so that's the role of the Citizens House. And so the first governance right that has recently come online for the Citizens House is a veto for protocol upgrades. In the first kind of 2 years of Optimism governance, we've mostly built out processes and structures for Token House and Retro PGF. And this year is the first year that we're really starting to hire up for the Citizens House team and building out the rules and rights for the Citizens House. And so ideally, these two houses keep each other in check, where we can have economic growth and prosperity, but also a platform with applications that are genuinely fun to use.
So basically, Optimism has two different houses that get to vote on certain things. They have certain rights. You've got the token house and you have the citizen house. The token house consists of token holders. These are people who own OP coin and they get to have certain rights. And then the citizens house is a different sort of thing. And how does one get into there? Like, what is the membership criteria for the citizen house? And what is the exact sort of balance of power or checks and balances that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I would say it's super nascent. This is a new body of work. We hired our first person onto the Citizens House team. The only right that's come online for Citizens House so far is the ability to veto protocol upgrades. And the first set of citizens is selected from Retro PGF badge holders. So this is community participants that have been entrusted with the right to allocate tokens towards funding public goods in the last 3 rounds of Retro PGF. There are really interesting design questions here. We don't want to create a self-perpetuating group of elites. How do you define who gets to be a citizen? What kind of hoops do you have to jump through? What's the immigration process to getting your green card and then your citizenship? These are all open questions. And so that's one aspect of it. Another aspect that I think we're currently ill-equipped to answer is, what are the rights of the token house? Which economic parameters are important for the token house to govern? And what information do they need to make good decisions around those parameters? Not only is there, capital allocation, there's also token monetary policy, inflation funding, where that inflation goes, how much inflation on an annual basis, what factors of the economy are you looking at?
But if someone doesn't have a co-founder, Jing, if you didn't have a co-founder, you started OP Labs, PBC, solo, and you wanted someone to run the foundation,
I would have quit before we were even going to launch a token. I would have been like, this shit sucks.
Yeah. So putting that aside, how would you pick someone to run the foundation, knowing what you know now on the other side of the fence?
I don't know if this is a cop-out answer, but you shouldn't be in that situation. If you're in that situation, you're not ready to launch a token, IMO. Either you are not actually launching a governance token for community ownership, because if you don't have a single other person that you can rely on to do something like this, then if you can't even build your own tiny contribution community, how are you going to build a broader community? Start with finding someone that you can onboard onto the vision. You'll learn a lot about gaps in your vision. Start by trying to make yourself somebody that other people can work with. You'll learn a lot about what it takes to build a community of people. If you cannot keep one other person motivated, aligned, and happy, you're going to have a hell of a time doing that for hundreds or thousands of people, as you likely intend to if you're launching a governance token. So that's first aspect of it. And that's by no means easy to do. And once you do have that trusted person, if they're in a position of authority at the foundation and you're in a position of authority somewhere else and your visions clash, how are you going to negotiate the outcomes together? Are you incentivized correctly? Each of you, have you interviewed for that? Have you tried on some trials and tribulations? Do you know can you model how this person is going to act in situations like that? Because the foundation role, especially at the beginning of a project, has a ton of influence over your token treasury. And if you are successful, that token treasury is going to be worth a lot. And so when someone is suddenly in charge of a lot, how does that change who they are as a person? This is something you can't really interview for, that's really hard to test for, and it can throw a wrench in things. And so I guess try to have someone that you can rely on to take on such a big bucket of responsibility. Figure out what your backup plan is on a legal, structural accountability level if that person doesn't behave the way that you expect them to. And go find some people who have done it before. And more difficult than instantiating the foundation is having the labs entity, foundation entity continue executing work productively and effectively and cooperatively. That shit, let me tell you, no fucking joke.
I was going to make a funny little point, like on my motif this podcast of like weird government analogies is like, it's kind of funny. When I was a kid, I used to wonder when they select Supreme Court justices, like since the Supreme Court justices like are not accountable to anybody, they're sovereign, right? Like it's a lifetime appointment. They can't be kicked off. I always wondered how the president that selects them ensures that they remain ideologically consistent with the president. But the answer, there's no enforcement mechanism. It's that they have a long judicial track record and they pick someone who already has the properties they want, right? And they just kind of assume that people are slow to change and they pick the correct person. So I'd say if I was picking someone, I'd apply the same framework as I'd say, I want to pick someone who has a long track record, who behaves in a way that is totally aligned with our project, and put them there, and obviously have all the usual gubernatorial controls, but trust on the fact that I know who this person is as an analog.
But can you ever really know somebody?
You can't, but that's...
Past performance is not indicative of future...
It's true.
Future performance.
It's true. And Supreme Court justices have changed and drifted along the ideological spectrum.
And then now give them a token treasury. Now how are they going to act?
It's hard mode. No doubt about that.
I think there are two traits that we do select for. One is obsession with improvement. People who are high ego about the quality of their work because they care deeply about their work, but low ego about what it takes to improve. And so people who actively seek feedback. I think this is going to be really important. Like if you're a founder and you're about to entrust this huge responsibility to somebody else, find someone who is already in the habit of coming to you for feedback on how they're operating and is interested in growing with you. That's like really the only kind of regular habit that you can rely on.
Totally.
It's a really interesting challenge. My other question to you, Jing, how much of your time do you spend thinking about vibes?
Okay. Oh my God. Oh. What is vibes? I have an answer. What, Eddie?
I don't want to spin the ball. Go ahead. I have an answer, but yeah.
What's your answer?
To me, the vibe is the subtextual things that are not right before us, that are implied by what we are seeing, that foretells the future behaviors that a person or a scene will exhibit.
Reputation?
That can be a part of it, but it's like let me put it this. Let me give it couch in an example. You meet someone, they don't say anything wrong, but they're acting a little weird, right? The vibe is wrong, right? You can't point at a specific thing and say, yes, I know they're going to do a bad thing because they said it, or they did a bad thing. They didn't, but they're doing behaviors that are indicative that there's something complicated behind the scenes that you can't see. And so shit is going to go wrong. things are going to go wrong, right? It's, in other words, it's what is implied by small clues that are not explicitly the thing that we're discussing, but foretell weird stuff in the future or things that are not right in the future. That's what vibe is. And so, like, in the early days of optimism had a great vibe, and it's, still has a great vibe, but it was like a very notable thing about it in its early days. What does that mean? What that meant was all the signs were right. The little subtle things were right. It was like the right type of nerds saying the right type of thing, focusing on the right types of problems, near the right type of people. All the little clues that are just beyond view that foretell that good things are going to happen, because that's just how these things.
Okay, I like that. The Twitter thread that's like boink, marry, kill, and then like yeah. And so some of the comments are like, oh, like, marry optimism or boink optimism because optimism will rub your belly, or optimism has a hot friend base. And I think really what they're saying is like the vibes are optimism takes care of its community. Optimism is considered legitimate by other legitimate players such as Coinbase. So what is vibes? I don't really know what vibes is, but I guess I spend a lot of time thinking about the humans, because at the end of the day, we're all sacks of water and we're just like trying to vibe, like trying to find some place to go jiggle to, because we don't I don't know if this is demotivational, but we don't actually need technology, right? Like we don't, we could just live in a cave and we could still survive. And people are like, oh yes, but like without AI, we couldn't find a cure for cancer. Well, maybe if we didn't have capitalism, we wouldn't have cancer, or it could go in a number of different ways. And so for smart people who want to feel meaning on a day-to-day basis, like your work is one really good way to go and feel that. And so how you feel about the way you spend a majority of your waking hours is what you're building net beneficial for the world? Are you productive? Like, are you actually able to create an impact? Do you like the core people that you have to interact with on a day-to-day basis? Is that culture? Is that vibes? Is that a community? I don't know, but I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And we put our money where our mouth is. And so I think sometimes when people say vibes, they can't put their finger on it. But one of the boink, marry, kill people was like, well, you just know that optimism is going to treat you right. And so that's built up over years of small decisions, whether it's actually paying out a critical vulnerability, even though the specific bug discovered was not listed among our critical vulnerabilities, or if that's sharing the fix for that vulnerability with the antagonistic forks because we prefer to protect their users over compete. Like there's like tons of small things like this over many, many years that I think we end up with vibes. Also because the branding is cute.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that is so consistent with like what I think about vibes, because if you're always kind of doing the right thing, and that's part of how you create a good vibe, you are literally giving people evidence, data, that in the future, you're going to keep behaving that way. If you go to a cool room, like think of it this way, you go to a cool place and the vibe is killer, right? Like the music's great, the lighting is amazing, the decor is great, just the feng shui of the space is great. It's not just an aesthetic consideration. The fact that there's all these other people there and it's busy means that the potential that you find someone else there that you overlap with in terms of your values and your aesthetic preferences is very high, right? That's because all those things are indicators that these people, if you find those things beautiful and charming, that everyone else will find those same things beautiful and charming too, right? I'm being like really like a nerd about it, but it's like these things are all data, you know? And if like, optimism is going to treat me right, like it's got that nice, like friendly vibe, that like literally means that if I deploy an optimism, I can take for granted that technical decisions being made in the future won't be net extractive and will be like serve the like common good of the collective. You see what I'm saying? It's like it's vibe translates into like literal expectation about concrete, very important economic, technical, social, whatever decisions.
Exactly. Yes. And so, all of that is like part of this explicit culture building we're putting out there about how we expect people to behave. Culture is how you behave and how you communicate. And that's part of the optimism culture. And so that's not to say people haven't had a terrible time interacting with optimism, whether it's the protocol, with the team, with me, fuck it. But the core intention is to put our money where our mouth is and ascribe to a set of values and be consistent with how we propagate those values. And if that hasn't been true for you, then feedback is the only way we know how to iterate on the next version of ourselves. So my DMs on Twitter are open.
I love that. As one sack of water, I feel very jiggled after this conversation.
Yes.
So I hope that all of our listeners are vibing too. I hope that the positivity is emanated out.
And if it's cringy, kill the part of you that cringes.
That's right. Get down with it.
This is great. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. This was excellent.
Bye.
See ya.